The most expensive mistakes are rarely made because people do not receive a warning. They happen because the warning comes from someone they have already decided not to believe. I learned that lesson on a quiet Sunday afternoon sitting around my parents' dining room table, and by the time they realized I had been telling the truth, almost everything they had spent a lifetime building was already gone. My name is Ethan Walker, and for years my family believed I was the cautious one who always imagined problems where none existed. My father, Robert Walker, often joked that if I saw sunshine, I would probably bring an umbrella just in case. Everyone laughed when he said it, including my mother, Susan, and my older sister, Emily. I laughed too because arguing never changed anyone's opinion. Still, deep inside I knew there was a difference between unnecessary fear and paying attention to details that everyone else ignored. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder whether everything could have been different if I had simply stayed quiet. Life certainly would have been easier. My parents would not have become frustrated with me. Family dinners would have remained comfortable. My relationship with my father might never have become strained. But every time I ask myself that question, I remember the documents spread across my desk, the numbers that refused to make sense, and the feeling in my stomach that told me something was terribly wrong. It all began when my parents announced they had finally found what they called the perfect investment opportunity. After working for nearly 40 years, my father had accumulated enough retirement savings to feel secure about the future. He had spent most of his career managing operations for a manufacturing company outside Columbus, Ohio. My mother had worked for many years as an elementary school librarian before retiring. They had lived carefully, avoided unnecessary debt, and saved consistently through every stage of life. Their dream was simple. They wanted to travel across the United States in a recreational vehicle, spend more time visiting national parks, help their future grandchildren with college expenses, and enjoy the peaceful retirement they had earned. When my father first mentioned the investment, his excitement was impossible to miss. He explained that one of his longtime friends had introduced him to a private investment company promising unusually strong returns through commercial real estate development. The presentation looked polished. The representatives sounded experienced. The projected numbers seemed almost too good to ignore. My father described it as the opportunity that would allow them to retire even more comfortably than they had imagined. My mother smiled every time they talked about it. Emily congratulated them and said they deserved every bit of success after decades of hard work. I wanted to share their excitement, but something immediately caught my attention. My own work as a business data analyst had taught me that whenever numbers appeared unusually perfect, they deserved a closer look. I asked a few simple questions during dinner. How long had the company been operating? Had they reviewed independent financial reports? Who regulated the investment? Was there public documentation available? My father answered patiently at first, saying the company had already explained everything during their seminar. Emily rolled her eyes with a smile and joked that I was conducting another interrogation. Everyone laughed again, but I could not ignore the feeling that continued growing stronger with every answer. The next morning I searched through public business records before leaving for work. The company had changed names twice within several years. Several affiliated businesses had quietly dissolved. The executive team had surprisingly little verified history compared to the image presented in their promotional materials. None of these discoveries proved fraud by themselves, but together they painted a picture that deserved far more attention than anyone in my family seemed willing to give. That evening I drove to my parents' house carrying printed records inside a folder. I expected appreciation because I believed I was helping them avoid unnecessary risk. Instead, the conversation quickly became uncomfortable. My father glanced at the documents for only a few seconds before placing them back on the table. He said every successful opportunity attracted criticism online, and that successful investors understood the importance of calculated risk. I explained calmly that these were not anonymous internet comments. They were official business filings available through public records. My mother looked uncertain, but remained quiet. Emily sighed and said I always managed to find problems with everything. I reminded them that I was not asking them to abandon the investment forever. I was only asking them to pause until we understood exactly where their retirement savings would be going. My father leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. His expression changed from confidence to irritation. He asked why I found it so difficult to celebrate good news without trying to ruin it. I answered honestly that I would rather make everyone uncomfortable for one evening than watch them lose everything they had worked their entire lives to earn. Silence settled across the dining room. My mother stared down at her coffee cup. Emily looked toward my father, waiting for his response. After several long seconds, he slowly stood from his chair and walked toward the window before turning back to face me. He said he appreciated that I cared about the family, but he believed I had allowed skepticism to become my entire personality. He reminded everyone that I had always questioned decisions instead of trusting people. Then, looking directly into my eyes, he said something that stayed with me long after the dinner ended. He told me that sometimes the greatest obstacle to happiness was believing you were the smartest person in every room. He said I needed to stop interfering in decisions that belonged to my parents because they were fully capable of managing their own future. No one at the table defended me. My mother avoided eye contact because she disliked conflict. Emily quietly agreed that our parents deserved encouragement instead of constant warnings. I gathered the folder from the table, thanked them for listening, and walked toward the front door. Before leaving, I turned back one final time and spoke as calmly as I could. I told them I sincerely hoped I was wrong because nothing would make me happier than seeing them enjoy the retirement they had earned. But if the information I had found turned out to be accurate, I wanted them to remember that I had not tried to control their choices. I had only tried to protect the people I loved most. As I drove home through the quiet streets that evening, I could not shake the feeling that this conversation was far from over. Something hidden beneath that polished investment opportunity still refused to make sense, and although my family had stopped listening, I knew I could not simply pretend everything was fine. The following morning I arrived at my office earlier than usual, but instead of preparing for the reports waiting in my inbox, I opened every public database I could legally access. My father believed I was simply unwilling to trust people, yet my concern had never been based on instinct alone. It was based on patterns. Throughout my career as a business data analyst, I had learned that numbers often revealed truths long before headlines did. Companies could create polished presentations, confident executives could deliver convincing speeches, and glowing testimonials could persuade almost anyone, but financial records rarely cared about appearances. If something was wrong, the evidence would eventually surface. I simply hoped I could find it before my parents committed their retirement savings. During my lunch break, I searched corporate filings, property records, archived business registrations, and publicly available legal documents. The more I investigated, the more uncomfortable I became. The investment company itself appeared relatively new, yet several executives had previously managed businesses that quietly disappeared after only a few years. None of those closures automatically proved misconduct, but they established a pattern of short-lived ventures that deserved careful examination. Even stranger, the commercial properties highlighted during the investment presentation did not always match publicly available ownership records. Some addresses were connected to different companies entirely, while others showed limited activity despite being described as thriving developments. Every new discovery raised another question instead of providing reassurance. That evening, I organized everything into a spreadsheet, highlighting every inconsistency alongside links to the original public records. I wanted facts rather than assumptions because I knew emotion would never convince my father. Robert Walker respected evidence, even if he had refused to examine mine the night before. My plan was simple. I would continue gathering information until the facts became impossible to ignore. A few days later, I stopped by my parents' house after work, hoping enough time had passed for everyone to approach the conversation more calmly. My mother greeted me warmly at the front door, but I immediately sensed the tension lingering beneath her smile. She invited me into the kitchen where she prepared coffee while my father finished mowing the lawn. For a few quiet minutes, we spoke about ordinary things, including the weather, my work, and Emily's upcoming business trip. Then my mother gently asked whether I had truly believed something dangerous was happening with the investment. I answered honestly that I did not know yet, but I believed there were enough unanswered questions to justify slowing down before making irreversible decisions. She sighed softly and admitted she had wondered about some of the details herself, but she trusted my father's judgment because he had always managed their finances responsibly. Before I could respond, the back door opened and my father walked inside carrying his gardening gloves. His expression immediately hardened when he noticed the folder resting beside my coffee cup. He shook his head before I had even spoken. "Ethan," he said quietly, "we already had this conversation." I remained calm and explained that I had uncovered additional public records since our last discussion. I asked for 10 minutes, nothing more. He reluctantly agreed, although his crossed arms made it clear his patience was already fading. I carefully walked through each document without exaggeration or accusation. I showed the inconsistent property ownership records, the dissolved affiliated companies, and the executive histories that raised legitimate concerns. My father listened longer than I expected, occasionally asking practical questions about where I had obtained each document. I appreciated that because it meant he was at least considering the information. Unfortunately, when I finished, he simply leaned back in his chair and smiled with quiet confidence. He told me that successful investors always looked beyond temporary irregularities because complicated business structures often appeared confusing to outsiders. He believed I was mistaking complexity for dishonesty. My mother looked from one of us to the other, clearly unsure what to believe. Before she could ask another question, Emily arrived unexpectedly after work. She walked into the kitchen carrying takeout containers for dinner and quickly noticed the stack of documents spread across the table. After hearing only a brief explanation, she laughed lightly and said I was still trying to save everyone from an opportunity they actually understood better than I did. Emily had always admired people who projected confidence, and the investment company's polished presentations had impressed her immediately. She reminded our parents that thousands of successful people invested in private ventures every year. Then she looked directly at me and asked whether I had ever considered that constantly expecting disaster might prevent good things from happening. Her words stung because they echoed my father's criticism almost perfectly. I wanted to argue, but experience had taught me that repeating the same facts rarely changed minds already made up. Instead, I quietly gathered my papers and thanked everyone for hearing me out again. As I prepared to leave, my father stopped me near the front door. His voice softened slightly as he placed a hand on my shoulder. He said he knew my intentions were good, but he believed I needed to let people make their own decisions. I nodded respectfully because I understood his point, yet something inside me refused to let the matter rest. Driving home that evening, I called an old college friend who worked in commercial banking. Without mentioning my parents or revealing confidential information, I described the investment structure and asked whether anything sounded unusual. He paused for several seconds before answering. He admitted the arrangement was not necessarily fraudulent, but he recommended obtaining an independent financial review before investing significant retirement assets. His cautious response strengthened my concern even further. Over the following week, I spent nearly every evening researching additional records instead of relaxing after work. My apartment gradually filled with printed documents, handwritten notes, and spreadsheets spread across the dining table. Every answer uncovered 2 more questions. I discovered that several promotional claims could not be independently verified, while projected returns appeared significantly higher than comparable investments in the same market. None of it proved criminal behavior, but together the evidence painted an increasingly troubling picture. One Friday afternoon, while reviewing another batch of public filings, I noticed something I had overlooked before. A consulting firm repeatedly appeared alongside multiple companies connected to the investment group. The same business address surfaced again and again under different names, different officers, and different registration dates. I stared at the screen for several minutes, feeling the same uneasiness that had followed me since my parents first announced their plans. I knew I had not reached the truth yet, but for the first time I believed I was following the trail that might eventually reveal it. Whether my family chose to believe me or not, I could no longer walk away. Too much was at stake, and every new discovery convinced me that the warning I had given them was only the beginning of a much larger story. Over the next 2 weeks, my investigation became less of a personal concern and more of an obligation I could no longer ignore. Every evening after work, I sat at my dining room table surrounded by stacks of printed records, financial statements, business registrations, and handwritten notes that gradually covered every available inch of space. I was not trying to prove myself right. I was trying to prove myself wrong. Every new document I opened, I hoped to discover a simple explanation that would erase my concerns and allow me to call my parents with good news. Instead, every answer seemed to uncover another inconsistency waiting beneath the surface. Eventually, I reached the point where I realized I needed someone with deeper financial expertise to review everything independently. If experienced professionals looked at the same evidence and dismissed my concerns, I promised myself I would finally let the matter go. Through a former coworker, I arranged a meeting with Michael Turner, a respected financial advisor who had spent more than 25 years evaluating investment structures for private clients and retirement portfolios throughout Central Ohio. I did not tell him my parents were involved because I wanted his opinion without emotion influencing his judgment. Carrying 2 organized binders filled with public records, I met him at a quiet coffee shop near downtown Columbus on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Michael greeted me warmly, listened patiently while I explained the situation, and spent nearly an hour reviewing every document I had collected. Occasionally, he paused to underline a paragraph or compare one filing with another. When he finally closed the binder, he leaned back thoughtfully before choosing his words very carefully. He told me that nothing he had seen conclusively proved fraudulent activity. However, he also admitted that several details concerned him enough that he would never recommend a retired couple invest the majority of their life savings without significantly more independent verification. He explained that unusually complicated ownership structures, constantly changing corporate entities, and inconsistent public disclosures often deserved far more scrutiny than attractive promotional presentations. His conclusion was measured rather than dramatic, but it confirmed exactly what my instincts had been telling me from the beginning. Before leaving, Michael encouraged me to continue gathering verifiable facts instead of relying on assumptions. He reminded me that evidence, not emotion, always carried the greatest weight. As I drove home that evening, I felt both relieved and frustrated. Relieved because an experienced professional had recognized the same warning signs. Frustrated because even his opinion still fell short of the definitive proof I needed to convince my parents. The following Saturday, I visited their house once again, determined to approach the conversation with patience instead of urgency. My father welcomed me politely, but I could immediately sense that he expected another disagreement. We sat together on the back patio while my mother prepared lunch inside. I explained that I had asked an independent financial advisor to review publicly available information. Before I could finish, my father's expression changed noticeably. He asked why I continued involving strangers in private family matters. I answered honestly that I had removed every personal detail because I only wanted an objective opinion. Then I carefully repeated Michael's conclusion exactly as he had stated it, emphasizing that he had not accused anyone of wrongdoing. He had simply recommended additional verification before risking retirement savings. My father remained silent for several moments before slowly shaking his head. He said experienced advisors often disagreed because every investment carried different levels of risk. Then he reminded me that the company had already answered every question during multiple seminars attended by dozens of investors. According to him, if there were serious problems, someone else would certainly have discovered them already. I understood why that argument sounded reasonable, but something about it unsettled me even more. History was full of situations where large groups believed reassuring stories until reality forced them to confront uncomfortable truths. My mother quietly asked whether delaying the investment for a few months would really make such a difference. Before I could answer, my father gently interrupted and explained that opportunities like this rewarded decisive action. Waiting too long, he believed, could mean missing the strongest returns. His confidence remained completely unshaken. I looked at my mother and saw uncertainty in her eyes, yet she trusted him enough to set those doubts aside. Later that afternoon, Emily stopped by after returning from her business trip. She immediately sensed the tension and asked what had happened. My father summarized our discussion in only a few sentences before smiling and joking that I had recruited financial experts to support my endless investigations. Emily laughed politely before telling me that successful people often reach success because they recognized opportunities others were too cautious to pursue. She reminded me that fear alone had never built prosperous futures. I calmly responded that responsible decisions were never built on blind optimism either. The conversation ended without raised voices, but everyone knew no one's opinion had changed. Driving home once again, I realized I had exhausted every reasonable argument available to me. Facts alone were no longer enough because my parents had already decided whom they trusted. That evening, I organized every document into digital folders, carefully labeling dates, business entities, property records, and executive histories. If I continued this investigation, I needed to become even more methodical. Around midnight, while searching through archived regulatory filings, I stumbled upon a brief reference to a civil complaint involving one of the consulting firms connected to the investment network. The complaint itself had been dismissed years earlier because of insufficient evidence, but the names listed inside matched several executives appearing throughout my growing collection of records. My heart immediately began racing. It still was not proof of wrongdoing, yet it demonstrated another connection that had never appeared anywhere in the company's promotional materials. The next morning, I expanded my search into newspaper archives, business journals, and historical corporate announcements. Most articles described ordinary business activity, but a handful referenced projects that had quietly disappeared after attracting significant investor interest. None of the reports reached national attention. Most people would never have noticed them. Still, taken together with everything else I had uncovered, they formed a pattern too, consistent to dismiss as coincidence. For the first time since beginning my investigation, I accepted a difficult truth. I could no longer rely on someone else to uncover the full story. If the answers existed, I would have to keep following every document, every public filing, and every overlooked connection until the complete picture finally emerged, even if it meant standing completely alone against the people I loved most. By the beginning of the following month, my investigation had become more organized than ever before. Every document was categorized by company name, registration date, executive history, property ownership, and financial disclosure. Color-coded tabs separated verified facts from unanswered questions because I refused to let assumptions influence my judgment. The more disciplined I became, the clearer one pattern emerged. Nearly every road led back to the same small network of businesses that appeared unrelated on the surface but quietly shared addresses, consultants, or corporate officers behind the scenes. Individually, none of those connections seemed alarming. Together, they painted a picture that grew more troubling every day. One evening, while reviewing another batch of archived corporate filings, I noticed a consulting company that had appeared repeatedly throughout my research. Its name had surfaced in investment documents, real estate transactions, and several dissolved businesses connected to the executives promoting my parents' opportunity. Curious, I began tracing every publicly available record associated with that consulting firm. After several hours, I uncovered something that immediately caught my attention. One former executive listed on an older registration had quietly resigned shortly before several affiliated companies disappeared. There was nothing illegal about resigning from a company, but the timing aligned almost perfectly with the sequence of business closures I had already documented. I spent the rest of the evening comparing dates, ownership records, and archived announcements until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. For the first time since beginning my investigation, the scattered pieces no longer looked random. They fit together with uncomfortable consistency. The following afternoon, I contacted Michael Turner again and asked whether he would be willing to review my latest findings. We met in his office the next day. Unlike our first conversation, this meeting lasted almost 2 hours. Michael carefully examined every timeline I had assembled and occasionally stopped to ask detailed questions about where individual records had originated. When we finished, he remained silent for several moments before speaking. He told me that I had done impressive work organizing publicly available information, but he reminded me that patterns alone could not establish intent or misconduct. Then he surprised me by saying something I had not expected. He believed the information deserved attention from someone experienced in investigative reporting because journalists often had access to interviews, historical sources, and background information unavailable through ordinary public records. He emphasized that he was not encouraging sensational accusations. He simply believed independent reporting might answer questions neither of us could resolve alone. His suggestion stayed with me during the entire drive home. At first, I hesitated because I had never spoken with a journalist before, and I worried about unnecessarily involving outsiders in something that still affected my family. Yet the more I considered Michael's advice, the more reasonable it became. If everything was legitimate, responsible reporting would likely confirm that conclusion. If not, perhaps someone with greater investigative resources could uncover what I could not. After researching several local reporters known for covering financial accountability and consumer protection, One name appeared repeatedly. Rachel Brooks had spent years investigating business practices throughout Ohio, earning a reputation for careful reporting built on verified evidence rather than speculation. I sent her a respectful email explaining that I had uncovered a series of public records involving interconnected businesses and simply wanted to know whether the information justified further review. I attached only a small sample of documents rather than overwhelming her with everything I had collected. Honestly, I expected no reply. Journalists were busy, and I assumed my message would disappear among hundreds of others. 2 days later, my phone rang during lunch. Rachel introduced herself and thanked me for organizing the records so clearly. She explained that she could not draw conclusions from the documents alone, but she admitted several details immediately stood out. She asked whether I would be willing to meet and explain how I had connected the various companies. The following Saturday, we met at a quiet public library conference room. I brought my binders while Rachel carried a notebook filled with questions. What impressed me most was not her skepticism, but her patience. She challenged every assumption I made, asked me to identify the original source for every document, and insisted that every timeline be supported by publicly available evidence. Instead of feeling discouraged, I found her approach reassuring because it reflected exactly how I believed serious investigations should work. By the end of our meeting, she thanked me again and explained that she intended to conduct her own independent research before reaching any conclusions. She promised nothing beyond that. As I walked back to my car, I felt neither victorious nor relieved. I simply felt grateful that someone else was finally willing to examine the evidence without dismissing it after a few minutes. Meanwhile, life continued as though nothing unusual was happening. My parents remained excited about their investment plans. During a family dinner the following weekend, my father enthusiastically described future travel destinations he and my mother hoped to visit after their returns began growing. My mother talked about finally replacing the aging kitchen appliances they had postponed purchasing for years. Emily smiled as she listened, already discussing family vacations we could all enjoy together once our parents had greater financial flexibility. I sat quietly for much of the evening, unable to share their optimism because every conversation reminded me how much they were preparing to risk. Before leaving that night, I asked my father one final question. I simply wanted to know whether he had signed any binding agreements yet. He answered that the paperwork would likely be completed within the next couple of weeks after one final meeting with company representatives. Hearing those words filled me with a sense of urgency I had never experienced before. My window to prevent a devastating mistake was rapidly closing. Early the next morning, Rachel called again. Her voice remained calm, but I immediately recognized a different tone from our previous conversation. She explained that after reviewing several historical records and conducting preliminary interviews, she had uncovered additional connections involving the same network of businesses I had identified. She stressed that the investigation was still incomplete and that every fact required further verification before publication. Even so, she believed enough unanswered questions existed to justify continuing her work. After ending the call, I looked across the folders covering my dining room table and realized the search for answers had entered an entirely different stage. For weeks I had been chasing isolated clues by myself. Now experienced professionals were independently finding similar paths. I still did not know exactly where those paths would lead, but for the first time I believed the complete truth was no longer hidden as deeply as it had once seemed. Rachel Brooks and I agreed on one important principle before either of us continued another step. Neither of us wanted to accuse anyone unfairly. Every statement had to be supported by documents. Every connection had to be verified, and every conclusion had to withstand careful examination. That commitment gave me confidence because I had never been searching for someone to blame. I had only wanted enough reliable information to keep my parents from making a decision they could not reverse. During the following week, Rachel remained busy conducting interviews and requesting additional public records while I continued reviewing every new filing that became available. We spoke briefly every few days, usually comparing timelines instead of theories. It was a slow process, but each conversation revealed another small piece of a puzzle that had once seemed impossible to understand. Meanwhile, my parents moved steadily toward finalizing their investment. My father appeared happier than I had seen him in years. He spent evenings reading travel magazines and discussing national parks he hoped to visit with my mother after retirement. Yellowstone, Glacier, Acadia, and the Grand Canyon filled their conversations. My mother started collecting brochures for recreational vehicles and even joked about learning how to cook in a tiny camper kitchen. Watching them plan their future should have made me happy. Instead, every smile they shared increased the weight I carried because I knew how much of that future depended on a decision I still believed was dangerously rushed. A few days later, my father called unexpectedly. For a brief moment, I thought he might have reconsidered everything. Instead, he invited me to attend one final investment presentation with the company representatives before they signed the paperwork. He explained that perhaps hearing everything directly from the professionals would finally ease my concerns. I accepted immediately because I wanted one last opportunity to ask questions face to face. The presentation took place inside a well-appointed conference room at a suburban business center just outside Columbus. The atmosphere projected confidence from the moment we arrived. Professionally dressed staff welcomed guests by name. Refreshments were neatly arranged along one side of the room, and large display screens rotated photographs of impressive commercial properties accompanied by optimistic financial projections. Nearly every attendee appeared excited about the opportunity. Many spoke enthusiastically with one another about retirement plans, family goals, and financial independence. Looking around the room, I understood why my parents trusted the company. Everything had been carefully designed to inspire confidence. The presentation itself was polished and persuasive. Executives spoke comfortably about market trends, long-term growth, and carefully managed risk. Charts displayed impressive historical returns, while testimonials described satisfied investors who praised both the professionalism of the company and the stability of its projects. Had I attended without weeks of prior research, I might have reached the same conclusion as everyone else in the room. When the question and answer session began, I politely raised my hand. I introduced myself simply as the son of prospective investors and asked whether the company could explain several ownership changes involving affiliated businesses that appeared throughout publicly available records. The presenter smiled politely before offering a broad explanation about normal corporate restructuring within expanding organizations. It sounded reasonable until I asked a follow-up question referencing specific registration dates and company names. For the first time, the presenter hesitated. He glanced briefly toward another executive before responding that he would need to verify those historical details and would gladly provide clarification later. I thanked him respectfully and sat down without pressing further. Throughout the remainder of the presentation, I noticed something subtle. Every time detailed documentation was requested, the answers became noticeably less specific than the confident explanations used during the prepared presentation. Most attendees never seemed to notice the difference, but I did. So did my father. As we walked toward the parking lot afterward, he admitted that a few of my questions had been reasonable. My heart lifted for the first time in weeks. I carefully suggested delaying the investment until every answer could be independently verified. Instead of agreeing, he smiled gently and placed his hand on my shoulder. He said that no company could possibly remember every historical filing during a live presentation. Minor administrative details, in his opinion, did not outweigh years of apparent business success. My brief moment of hope quietly disappeared. 3 days later, Rachel called with another update. She had confirmed several additional connections involving executives and consulting firms through archived business records that had not appeared in recent public summaries. Although none of the information independently established misconduct, the growing pattern had become difficult to dismiss. She explained that her editors had authorized additional reporting because they believed the story warranted further investigation before publication. I thanked her and immediately considered calling my parents again. Then I stopped myself. Without definitive findings, another warning would likely sound no different from every previous conversation. I decided instead to prepare one final package containing every verified document, every timeline, and every independent opinion I had gathered over the past several weeks. I delivered the organized binder to my parents on a quiet Saturday morning. My father accepted it respectfully and promised he would read everything before making his final decision. His words sounded sincere enough that I left their house believing I had finally broken through the wall separating us. Late Sunday evening he called. His voice remained calm, but I immediately recognized the disappointment beneath it. He thanked me for the enormous amount of work I had invested, acknowledged that I genuinely cared about protecting the family, and then quietly informed me that he and my mother had signed the investment agreement that afternoon. They believed delaying any longer would mean losing an opportunity they had spent years waiting to find. For several seconds I could not speak. I stared silently through the window of my apartment while rain tapped softly against the glass. Finally, I wished them the very best and told my father with complete honesty that I hoped every concern I had raised would eventually prove unnecessary. After we ended the call, I placed my phone on the kitchen table beside the remaining copies of every document I had collected. An overwhelming sense of helplessness settled over me because I understood something my parents did not. My ability to prevent the decision had ended the moment they signed those papers. All I could do now was continue preserving every piece of evidence and hope with everything I had that the future would somehow prove me wrong. The weeks that followed passed with an uneasy silence that somehow felt heavier than every disagreement my family and I had shared before. My parents no longer brought up the investment during our conversations, and I deliberately avoided asking about it because I already knew what they would say. My father believed they had made the right decision, and no amount of additional discussion would change that. Instead, I focused on my work during the day while continuing to monitor every public record connected to the companies I had investigated. Rachel Brooks remained in contact, although our conversations became less frequent because she was waiting for official responses to several information requests. Michael Turner occasionally checked in as well, reminding me that patience often revealed what urgency could not. Despite their encouragement, I found myself hoping every morning that I would discover evidence proving my concerns had been unnecessary. I wanted nothing more than to admit that I had worried too much. Nearly 6 weeks after my parents signed their investment agreement, small changes began appearing where no one outside the company would normally notice them. One affiliated business quietly updated its corporate registration. Another removed several executive names from its public website without explanation. A commercial property highlighted during the investment presentation was suddenly no longer featured in the company's promotional materials. None of those developments sounded dramatic by themselves, but together they matched the same pattern I had documented since the beginning. I forwarded the updates to Rachel, who replied only a few hours later. She had noticed the same changes independently and had already begun contacting company representatives for clarification. Their responses, she explained, had become noticeably slower than before. Several interview requests had gone unanswered entirely. That alone did not prove anything, but it certainly did not ease either of our concerns. A few days later, my mother called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded cheerful at first as she asked about my work and whether I planned to visit the following weekend. We spoke comfortably for several minutes before she casually mentioned that one of the quarterly investor updates had been postponed because the company was completing an internal financial review. She insisted that the representatives had described the delay as routine, but I could hear uncertainty beneath her calm tone. I carefully asked whether my father seemed concerned. She paused before answering that he believed every growing business occasionally adjusted schedules. She quickly changed the subject, yet after ending the call, I could not stop thinking about the hesitation in her voice. For the first time since this entire situation began, my mother no longer sounded completely confident. Another week passed before the first public signs appeared. Local business publications reported that several commercial development projects connected to the investment network had experienced unexpected financing delays. The articles remained balanced and avoided speculation, describing the issues as temporary administrative complications. Most readers would probably have skimmed past them without a second thought. I read every word 3 times. The names, addresses, and business entities matched the files stacked neatly across my apartment. Later that evening, Rachel called again. Her normally composed voice carried a quiet urgency I had never heard before. She explained that multiple independent sources had begun sharing similar concerns regarding delayed payments and incomplete disclosures involving several companies within the same business network. She emphasized that her investigation was still ongoing and that every claim required additional verification before publication. Even so, she believed events were beginning to move much faster than anyone expected. I thanked her before hanging up and immediately stared at my parents' phone numbers stored in my contacts. I wanted to call them. I wanted to beg them to withdraw every dollar if that was still possible. But I also remembered every previous conversation we had shared. Every warning had widened the distance between us instead of bringing us closer. Without confirmed evidence, another emotional phone call would almost certainly accomplish nothing except convince my father that I still refused to let the matter go. I spent nearly an hour pacing across my apartment before deciding on a different approach. Instead of arguing, I carefully organized the newest articles, updated corporate filings, and recent business changes into another chronological report. I mailed the package directly to my parents with a short handwritten note. I wrote only one sentence. Please read this carefully before making any additional financial decisions. 2 days passed without any response. On the third evening, my father finally called. His voice remained calm, but I immediately recognized the emotional distance between us. He thanked me for sending the information and assured me he had reviewed every page. Then he explained that he had already spoken directly with one of the company executives, who dismissed the recent reports as ordinary business adjustments exaggerated by incomplete media coverage. According to my father, the representative had confidently assured investors that upcoming announcements would address every concern. He believed them. I listened quietly before asking only one question. I wanted to know whether he had considered requesting a temporary withdrawal until those announcements became public. He answered without hesitation. No. He believed reacting to uncertainty would only create unnecessary losses. After the call ended, I realized there was nothing left for me to say. Every warning I had given had been answered with another reassurance from people my parents trusted more than their own son. The following Monday morning, I arrived at work to find 3 missed calls from Rachel waiting on my phone. I stepped into an empty conference room and returned her call immediately. She answered almost instantly. She explained that after weeks of investigation, her editors had approved publication of the first article because enough independently verified facts now existed to support the story. It would not accuse anyone of criminal conduct. Instead, it would document the complicated network of affiliated companies, unanswered financial questions, delayed projects, and concerns raised by independent experts. Every sentence had been reviewed repeatedly by editors and attorneys before publication. Rachel believed readers deserved access to verified information so they could make informed decisions for themselves. I thanked her sincerely because I knew how carefully she had handled every stage of the investigation. When I ended the call, I remained standing beside the conference room window for several minutes, watching the morning traffic move steadily below. Somewhere across the city, my parents were beginning another ordinary day, believing their future remained secure. They still had no idea that within hours the carefully polished story they had trusted for months would begin to unravel in front of the entire community. Rachel's article was published early Tuesday morning, and within a few hours it had spread far beyond the local business community. The headline itself remained careful and factual, avoiding sensational language, but the substance of the investigation was impossible to ignore. It outlined the complicated web of affiliated companies, documented repeated changes in corporate registrations, highlighted inconsistencies in public disclosures, and included comments from independent financial professionals who encouraged investors to seek additional verification before committing retirement savings. Every statement was supported by publicly available records or confirmed interviews. There were no accusations beyond the available evidence. Yet the article accomplished something I had been unable to do for months. It caused people to stop and ask questions. Throughout the day, my phone vibrated constantly with news alerts, emails, and messages from coworkers who had seen the story. Several simply commented that the investigation was remarkably detailed. Others wondered whether additional reports would follow. I ignored nearly every notification because only one reaction truly mattered to me. Around noon, my mother called. I answered immediately. Her voice sounded different than I had ever heard before. The confidence that had once filled every conversation had been replaced by uncertainty. She quietly asked whether I had known Rachel Brooks before the investigation began. I explained honestly that we had met only after I gathered enough publicly available information to believe the records deserved an independent review. I also reminded her that Rachel had verified everything herself before publishing a single sentence. My mother remained silent for several long moments before telling me that my father had spent the entire morning reading the article over and over again. Neither of them had expected to recognize so many company names and business addresses connected to the investment they had trusted. Before ending the call, she softly asked whether I could come over that evening. When I arrived, the atmosphere inside my parents' home felt completely different from every previous visit. The travel brochures that had once covered the kitchen counter were gone. The excitement that had filled the house only weeks earlier had quietly disappeared. My father sat alone at the dining room table, surrounded by printed copies of Rachel's article, the binders I had given him months earlier, and several investment documents he had finally removed from their folders. He looked older than I remembered, not because of time, but because of disappointment. Without saying a word, he motioned for me to sit across from him. For nearly 20 minutes, we compared my original timeline with the newly published investigation. One by one, the connections matched exactly. Company names, executive histories, consulting firms, property records, and registration dates all aligned with the research I had patiently assembled over several months. My father never interrupted. Occasionally, he closed his eyes for a moment before continuing to read. My mother quietly sat beside him, turning pages without speaking. Eventually, my father reached into the binder I had delivered weeks earlier, but that he had only skimmed before making his final decision. This time he read every page carefully. I watched him pause at the handwritten note attached to the front. Please read this carefully before making any additional financial decisions. He slowly placed the note back on the table and covered his face with both hands. No one spoke for what felt like several minutes. Finally, he looked up and asked me the question I had been waiting months to hear. He wanted to know whether there was still anything they could do. I answered as honestly as I could. I explained that I did not know. Some investment agreements included withdrawal provisions, while others imposed restrictions depending on timing and contractual terms. I encouraged him to contact both the company and an independent attorney immediately instead of relying solely on explanations from company representatives. For the first time since this entire situation had begun, my father did not argue with a single word I said. The next several days became an exhausting blur of phone calls, document reviews, and urgent meetings. My parents contacted the investment company seeking clarification about the issues raised in the investigation. The responses they received sounded far less confident than the polished presentations they had attended months earlier. Deadlines became uncertain. Meetings were postponed. Questions that once received immediate answers now required additional review. Every delay seemed to confirm what I had feared from the beginning. During that same week, Rachel published a second report after verifying additional information through newly available public records and interviews with other investors. Several people had begun sharing experiences similar to the concerns my parents now faced. Again, the reporting remained balanced and factual, but the growing pattern became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Michael Turner also reviewed the newest developments and carefully explained each update to my parents without judgment or criticism. He never told them they had made a foolish decision. Instead, he focused entirely on helping them understand the facts now available and the practical options that still remained. Watching him treat them with dignity during one of the hardest moments of their lives reminded me what true professionalism looked like. One evening, my sister Emily arrived unexpectedly while I was helping our parents organize financial records for another meeting. She quietly read through the growing stack of documents before sitting beside me in complete silence. After several minutes, she admitted that she had dismissed every warning I had given because she believed confidence was usually a sign of competence. She confessed that she had mistaken polished presentations for trustworthy evidence. I simply nodded because there was nothing to gain by reminding her how many times I had tried to explain my concerns. We were no longer searching for someone to blame. We were trying to understand the reality standing in front of us. Later that night, after Emily had gone home and my mother had gone upstairs to rest, my father remained seated at the dining room table staring at the original binder I had handed him weeks earlier. He gently ran his hand across the pages before speaking so quietly I almost missed his words. He said he now understood that every warning I had given had come from love rather than pride. He admitted that he had spent months believing I questioned his judgment because I wanted to prove myself right, when in reality I had only wanted to protect the family. Hearing those words brought me no satisfaction at all. I had never wanted recognition for being correct. I had wanted the future we had all imagined together to remain untouched. Sitting across from my father that evening, I realized the greatest tragedy was not that the truth had finally been revealed. It was that the truth had arrived only after the opportunity to prevent so much heartache had already slipped quietly away. The months that followed tested my family in ways none of us had ever imagined. Every week seemed to bring another disappointing update. Meetings that had once been promised with confidence were postponed without clear explanations. Phone calls that previously received immediate responses were now returned days later, if they were returned at all. Official statements became increasingly vague, repeating that internal reviews were underway and that investors would receive additional information as soon as possible. My parents continued hoping that everything would eventually stabilize, but with each passing week, that hope became more difficult to maintain. My father, who had always carried himself with quiet confidence, now spent long evenings at the dining room table reviewing documents instead of planning retirement trips. The colorful travel brochures that had once filled the kitchen drawer had disappeared completely. My mother no longer talked about replacing the kitchen appliances or purchasing the recreational vehicle they had dreamed about for years. Their conversations became shorter, quieter, and filled with uncertainty. Yet even during those difficult days, something unexpected began to change inside our family. For the first time in months, my parents stopped trying to defend their decision and started asking questions instead. My father invited me to help organize every financial record connected to the investment so we could understand exactly where things stood. We spent several weekends together sorting contracts, correspondence, account statements, and meeting notes into carefully labeled folders. There was something deeply humbling about sitting beside the same man who had once dismissed every concern I raised, only to now have him ask me to explain each document one page at a time. I answered every question patiently because this was never about proving who had been right. It was about helping my parents move forward with as much clarity as possible. Michael Turner continued guiding us through each available option with remarkable professionalism. He explained that although some of the invested funds might remain tied up while reviews continued, careful documentation and prompt legal guidance could still protect certain rights available to investors. His steady approach gave my parents something they desperately needed during that uncertain period, a practical path forward instead of overwhelming fear. Rachel Brooks also remained in contact from time to time. After publishing several carefully documented reports, she explained that regulatory agencies had begun reviewing information connected to multiple business entities mentioned throughout her investigation. She never speculated about outcomes or made dramatic predictions. She simply continued following verified facts, just as she had from the beginning. Watching both Michael and Rachel handle such a complicated situation with integrity reminded me that difficult circumstances often reveal the true character of people. One Sunday afternoon, Emily invited all of us to her home for dinner. It was the first family gathering in months that did not revolve around documents, investments, or unanswered questions. At first, the conversation stayed focused on ordinary topics such as work, neighbors, and local community events. Slowly, the atmosphere became more relaxed than any of us expected. After dessert, my father quietly stood from his chair, holding a glass of iced tea. His hands trembled slightly, not because of age, but because of the weight of what he wanted to say. He looked first at my mother, then at Emily, and finally at me. He admitted that for most of his life, he had believed experience alone guaranteed good judgment. He had always assumed that because he was older, worked hard, and managed his responsibilities carefully, he would naturally recognize serious mistakes before making them. He smiled sadly before saying that confidence without humility could become its own blind spot. Then he turned toward me and apologized in front of the entire family. He apologized not only for ignoring my warnings, but also for questioning my intentions. He admitted that he had mistaken persistence for arrogance when, in reality, every conversation I had initiated came from genuine concern for the people I loved most. The room became completely silent. My mother reached for his hand, while Emily quietly wiped tears from her eyes. I took a slow breath before answering. I told my father that I had never needed him to admit I was right, because being right had never been my goal. If I could have exchanged every correct prediction for one ordinary family dinner where none of this had happened, I would have done so without hesitation. I explained that love sometimes sounded uncomfortable because real concern often required asking difficult questions instead of offering easy reassurance. My father nodded slowly, understanding those words in a way he never could have only a few months earlier. As the evening continued, we talked honestly about mistakes, pride, trust, and how easily people could become persuaded by polished appearances when those appearances matched the future they desperately wanted to believe in. My mother quietly admitted that she had doubted several details from the beginning, but chose silence because she trusted my father completely. Emily confessed that she had allowed confidence and popularity to influence her judgment instead of examining the evidence for herself. No one blamed one another. Instead, everyone accepted responsibility for the choices they had made. That conversation became one of the most meaningful evenings our family had shared in years because every word was grounded in honesty instead of pride. Over the following months, my parents gradually adjusted to a different vision of retirement. Some of the dreams they had planned so carefully would need to wait, while others might never happen exactly as they once imagined. Surprisingly, neither of them spoke much about what had been lost. Instead, they focused on rebuilding confidence one practical decision at a time. They simplified their financial plans, met regularly with trusted advisors, and approached every future investment with far greater patience than before. My father even developed a habit that made me smile whenever I visited. Before making any important financial decision, no matter how small, he would place every document neatly across the dining room table and quietly say, "Let us read everything first." It became more than a routine. It became a reminder of the lesson our family had learned together. Looking back, I realized the greatest change had nothing to do with money. It was the way we listened to one another. We no longer assumed that age automatically meant wisdom or that youth automatically meant inexperience. We learned that truth deserved careful attention regardless of who spoke it. That lesson could never restore every opportunity my parents had lost, but it gave our family something far more valuable than financial security alone. It restored the trust that had nearly disappeared when we needed it most. Almost 1 year has passed since the evening my father looked across the dining room table and admitted that he should have listened before it was too late. Time did not erase every consequence of the choices my parents had made, but it slowly transformed the way our family understood those difficult months. Some of the retirement savings they had worked so hard to build were eventually recovered through legal processes and negotiated settlements, although not nearly enough to restore everything they had once expected. At first, my father struggled with that reality because he measured every missing dollar as another reminder of the decision he wished he could take back. Over time, however, I watched his perspective begin to change. Instead of counting only what had been lost, he gradually started recognizing everything that had remained. He still had his family. He still had his health. He still had another opportunity to rebuild with greater wisdom than before. Those realizations became the foundation for a very different future than the one he had originally imagined. My mother embraced that change with remarkable grace. She transformed the guest bedroom into a small reading room where she spent quiet afternoons enjoying novels she had collected during her years as a school librarian. She often invited neighborhood children to borrow books or simply sit and read together after school. Watching her create something meaningful without spending large amounts of money reminded all of us that fulfillment rarely depended on expensive plans. Emily also changed in ways I never expected. She became much more thoughtful before making important decisions and developed the habit of researching unfamiliar opportunities instead of relying on polished presentations or enthusiastic recommendations. Occasionally, she joked that she had inherited my habit of asking too many questions, and for the first time, everyone laughed without embarrassment because we all understood the value behind those questions. As for me, I returned to an ordinary routine that suddenly felt extraordinary simply because life had become peaceful again. My apartment was no longer covered with stacks of corporate filings and color-coded timelines. The binders that once filled my dining room table now rested neatly inside a storage cabinet, kept only as a reminder of a chapter one hoped never to repeat. My evenings became quieter. I spent more time visiting my parents without carrying folders under my arm. We talked about baseball, gardening, weather, books, and neighborhood events instead of financial documents. Those ordinary conversations became gifts none of us had fully appreciated before everything changed. One Saturday morning, my father invited me to breakfast at the small family-owned diner where we had eaten together throughout my childhood. The familiar smell of fresh coffee and pancakes immediately brought back memories of simpler years. We ordered the same meals we had always enjoyed, and for a while we simply talked about everyday life. After breakfast, my father reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully placed a worn notebook on the table between us. I recognized it immediately. Years earlier, when I had first started working as a business analyst, I carried that notebook everywhere, filling its pages with observations, calculations, and reminders to verify every important fact before reaching conclusions. During one family dinner long before this entire situation began, I had accidentally left it at my parents' house. My father smiled gently before sliding it across the table toward me. He told me he had kept it all this time because he once believed it represented my tendency to overthink everything. Now he saw it differently. He believed it represented discipline, patience, and the courage to keep searching for the truth even when no one wanted to hear it. I opened the notebook and quietly turned through the faded pages. Most of the notes no longer seemed important, but seeing them again reminded me how easily determination could be misunderstood by the people closest to us. My father then said something I have never forgotten. He told me that wisdom was not measured by how often someone was correct. Wisdom was measured by whether a person remained humble enough to listen when another voice might reveal something they had missed. Those words stayed with me long after we left the diner that morning. Several weeks later, our entire family gathered once again around the same dining room table where so many difficult conversations had taken place the previous year. This time there were no investment presentations, no binders filled with evidence, and no uncomfortable silence separating us. Instead, there was homemade food, laughter, family photographs, and genuine gratitude for another ordinary evening together. At one point, my father looked around the room and quietly said that losing money had been painful, but losing trust would have been far worse. He thanked every member of our family for refusing to let disappointment become permanent division. My mother reached for his hand. Emily smiled across the table, and I realized that healing had happened so gradually we almost failed to notice it. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether I regret continuing to warn my parents after they repeatedly dismissed my concerns. My answer has never changed. No. If I had remained silent simply to avoid conflict, I would have carried that silence for the rest of my life. Love is not measured by how comfortable our conversations are. Sometimes love requires asking difficult questions, presenting uncomfortable evidence, and standing alone for a while, because protecting the people who matter most is more important than protecting our own pride. I also learned another lesson that I carry with me every day. Intelligence alone is never enough. Experience alone is never enough. Confidence alone is never enough. The strongest families are built when every generation is willing to listen before making decisions that cannot easily be undone. My father once believed that warnings from his son reflected doubt instead of devotion. By the end of our journey, he understood that the greatest expressions of love are not always wrapped in reassuring words. Sometimes they arrive disguised as inconvenient truths that challenge everything we want to believe. Our family paid a high price to learn that lesson. But because we chose forgiveness instead of resentment, honesty instead of pride, and understanding instead of blame, the story did not end with what we lost. It ended with something far more valuable. We found our way back to one another, and that became the greatest investment any of us would ever make.